All right, folks, this is a part that many people have been waiting for a long time. The board of directors of the USP, our Vice President Secretary Jim Haynes, speaking with him on a phone conference, mentioned of this that he's been waiting a long time to see the science come back, work on the science, that is. Not since Binder, Groats, and Kovac has there been any scientific research done. So that's about close to 20 years that we've been waiting. We started the Science and Research Committee, as I said, on June 22nd, full new moon, 2015, and started a fundraising effort just due simply to the fact that you need to machine parts. We are working on a physical prototype. So the rumor is true. It's not, never was actually a, just hearsay. The whole purpose of our committee is to demonstrate the scientific concepts empirically, demonstratably, undeniably, conclusively proving that these concepts are not only true to nature, but will fundamentally change the way we think and conceive of this electric universe, as well as the entire electrical engineering field. Having met Darren last November, he came to research the archives. He found a lot of stuff that's been helpful to the construction of this device, which is still in the construction phase. We have a little bit longer to go yet before we're going to make any major announcements, but this committee has been meeting almost every week, and officially 6 times a year, every other month. But every week we've been meeting to discuss this. Alan Lee Atkins, one of the pioneers of the CD-ROM, who's speaking tomorrow, is on our committee. You got to be pretty brilliant if you can bring some new technology like the CD-ROM into existence, which I love because as a musician, I was recording to CD prior to discovering Pro Tools, which is another awesome program. But nonetheless, all these are steps in man's, putting the divine side of his spirit into his technology. Music equipment and technology is one of the greatest technologies in my opinion. But having said that, Darren has contributed so much in the past year and some months, making leaps and bounds of which everybody wants to hear about the progress. We are grateful to everyone who has donated to this. All of your donations are 100% traceable, and every receipt is saved. So far we've collected under I'd say about close to 4,000, wouldn't you, dollars. So it's not a large amount, but it's nonetheless allowed us to get very close. It's going to be a thrill to release some of the results at some point. Darren Colomb is a laboratory scientist, an inventor, musician, cosmogonist, philosopher. He is currently actively working on, as I said, this home AC generator system to alleviate energy dependency and seeking, with all of us, the funding for the USP Science and Research facility. Now, this facility would be state-of-the-art. We're talking where people could work full-time to do more with this, the scientific principles. But everyone on the Science and Research Committee as well understands the importance of the philosophy. So we have no divisions within this group. It's wonderful. The full power is available to us all. We want to advance and reform our current science paradigm. That is our lead scientist's major goal as well as my own. We all share it. It's my honor and privilege to welcome from Vermont, Darren Colomb.
All right.
Is that your real last name?
It is. We'll get there.
Are you related?
Probably. I asked my dad about it once, and one of these days we'll try to trace back, see if there's a connection. Yeah. We are French Canadian on that side, so who knows? I acknowledge the Scottish side of my mom's side too. First of all, it's great to be here. It's an honor to be speaking and meeting so many wonderful people, and it's really wonderful to be able to express these ideas, and people have somewhat of an idea of what you're talking about, which is it's not the normal day-to-day life for me. As Matt said, I am a laboratory scientist, and I come from a very traditional academic background. So basically, I'm going to be endeavoring in the next 40-ish minutes to differentiate between old concepts of science and the new concepts of science. This chart, thanks to Ramu for sending me this one, basically sums up all electromagnetic theory in one kind of chart. So it's a good way for me to say, this is everything I will not be covering. So the present concepts of science, our universe, as the Russell state, is an optical one. It is not electromagnetic. There is an interesting anecdote in the home study course, 3rd edition, that says basically we use the concepts of electricity and magnetism, those terms, only for your benefit, because the concepts need new language, and that new language doesn't really have anything to do with the old concepts. So I won't be, we'll get right past that. So the science of the future is based upon God, the creator. God is light, God is mind. Another way of saying this, and this is something that I know to be true, is that the universe is founded upon love. And that's a very personal thing. You have to arrive at that state for yourself. There's nobody that can do that for you. I arrived at that point myself, and yet I am a scientist, and so we can think in terms of the basis of love in terms of science, and that would be the concept of light. Light is synonymous with love, as is intelligence, law, balance. There are many terms that describe the same thing. So this chart, Dr. Russell likes to put lots of information in one particular diagram. We're going to go through some of these, but I do want to point out this concept of love can be applicable to light in the sense that everything is connected. We've heard these kinds of things today, and I don't want to repeat things too much. But coming from a traditional background, there's many things that are challenging about the Russell science, and when I got to a point where I felt comfortable with things, I realized that there's certain stumbling blocks that prevent people from really sort of moving forward with the science. And so I'm going to go through, to begin with, just things that I found that were difficult for myself and I feel are difficult for other people too. And then we can really dive into some detail. And tomorrow's talk will also dive into some very technical things and experiments as well. But I just, to begin with, there's a difficulty in science in the relationship of mind and motion. God thinks but one thing. That one thing is the divine idea of love, as I said. But how do we apply that to a scientific endeavor? So basically, we have cause and effect. The one white light of mind is cause. It is the real universe of knowing, mind at rest. Effect seems to be basically an extension of that, and this is a hard idea for science because we think cause and effect to be something else entirely other than this idea of an extension of one equilibrium, and that can be a hard stumbling block right to begin with. Like this quote says here, the zero universe of cause and the visible universe of effect. We sense effects and we believe in its reality. We don't know much about this. We're very much sense-based in our science. We believe in empirical, objective things that we can take apart and measure. However, that is only a simulation, and that is one of the hardest concepts to get right out of the bat, because we're so entrained in sort of a objective. If I can't measure it, it doesn't really exist. So, as just a caveat to that, Russell always talks about electric rings. I just want to point out that this idea is applicable to the sense of electric rings because it gives you an idea of where the electric rings are sourced from. They're sourced from mind. And so this idea of an electric body is really a simulation by motion around stillness. Oops, here we go. Another stumbling block, and this is a big one for me, is the limited sense perception. And I have this quote from Atomic Suicide. I find it very, very helpful with this. Basically, what we see is, we think we see large things. We look out into telescopes and we see, oh, gee, this is a really big universe. Things seem to be getting, farther apart and so forth. And we can see that the world is very large and we appear to be very small. But honestly, this is really just an optical illusion. And I find it interesting that that the visual field is conical, as you can see. So really what you see is this large thing out there is sort of matched with this small thing that's happening in the eye. And so there's this sort of this going togetherness where what you think is large out there is really only infinitesimally small within you. And so we can't really know the universe by objective sensing, because it's an illusion right off of the bat. So our senses are basically one way. They're not two-way. We see forward sequences, but we don't necessarily sense any kind of voiding flow, a backward flow. But there is a backward flow. As Jim mentioned, this idea of avoidance principle, every reaction of wave motion is voided as it occurs, is repeated as it is voided, and is recorded as it is repeated. Every happening anywhere is voided by its equal unhappening. Nothing in nature ever exceeds zero. It only seems to. Why does it seem to? Because our senses are divided. You see, we have 2 eyes, 2 ears, nostrils. So there's sort of a dividing equator, and so everything we see is duality. So our senses are interpreting basically only half of the story at any given time. So this is a way to really make sense of a lot of the things that Russell is saying. If you kind of understand this, that you say, okay, if I'm going to try to understand what I'm seeing, hearing, sense, perceiving, if you kind of keep in the back of your mind that what you're seeing to some extent is illusory, thank you. Because simply by the fact that it is dual. We're going to get into this tomorrow. I use this concept a lot when I'm doing coils because there's this whole idea of clockwise and counterclockwise. But as Jim was showing with that spiral, it's really one direction, but your senses can interpret two directions out of that. So it's an illusion. This is a way to kind of get around that. This is why Russell says you can know. And knowing is a bit beyond sensing in this regard. Covered the void. Okay, so if this universe is not electromagnetic in nature, what is it? It's optical, and it's an optical universe of gravity-controlled light. This means that this new science paradigm, deals with higher optics. It deals with the true nature of light. It deals with gravity, and I do not mean Newtonian gravity. It deals with wave mechanics. It deals with the geometry of space, and it deals of, for most important reasons for energy, it deals with cyclical thermodynamics rather than entropy, which is really a one-way concept. So I have this sort of a summary of wave geometry. Basically, to summarize that whole thing, waves compress the invisible light of cold space into visible light of incandescent suns. They then expand it to return visible light back again into cold space. Again, this thermodynamic cycle idea. This they do by means of gravity-controlled curvature, which is God's only tool to work with in creating this universe of motion. And we're going to get into that in more detail. So gravity is... has many, many meanings. I've found that Russell would use this term more than anything else to describe many aspects of motion. So to me, really what it represents is a unity of force. we have this idea of a duality that our senses are interpreting. We see things in terms of two things. We see gravitation and radiation. But really, it's one unity of force that is cyclical. So this chart really shows that really well, because he's saying it right here. All matter is cyclonically created. So matter as motion is controlled by gravity, which means that gravity accounts for the two apparent forces that we observe of compression and expansion. I know this is a bit hard to see, but basically this is sort of a radial concept of everything pointing in toward a center, a mutual center, and expansion being the opposite of that, which is everything moving out from a mutual center out towards space. By the way, Russell has his own way of saying this, but basically any center of a mass is north, and anything that is outside of that, all the way out to a cube boundary, would be south. And east-west is basically one circle direction all the way around. Just in case, I know some people are curious about those kinds of definitions. So now we understand that gravity is a force which is accounting for motion and the two-way direction of motion. It's bounded by the wave field, the cube wave field. And this behaves by analogy very much like a projector. So if the universe is sort of an optical one rather than electromagnetic, it stands to reason that you need some sort of a camera system. But it's very much like a three-dimensional camera system. If we could build one of these, it would be so advanced that you could simulate reality, which sort of leads you to the idea that that is exactly what reality is. It's some sort of a three-dimensional optical camera in which you have a projection and a reflection system. So this would be projection and reflection, and we're going to look in that in a little more detail. By the way, so one thing I want to point out about dimension too, there were 18 dimensions in the universal one, but this was subsequently revised to my liking, because the way I think about dimensions, I think of them in sort of building dimension of length, width, and breadth. And so you have this idea of God sort of is non-dimensional. It's sort of just a non-dimensional point. And then as you begin to extend into multiple dimensions, now you build out of one dimension to two dimensions to three dimension, which would be our dynamic universe of motion. So it's sort of a build-up, and this is why you get these intersecting planes at all right angles. And this accounts for many of the reasons that forces have the characteristics that they do. So another sort of a concept about this is that wave fields are within wave fields. So a way to think of this is there's a universal wave field, and it's sort of so massive that it encompasses the entire universe. And then there's subsequently smaller cubes within cubes to infinity, because it's an infinitely regressive structure. It just keeps going down to infinity and up to infinity. So this is nature's way of creating power, and we're going to get into that tomorrow a lot, because this is the whole basis behind power multiplication. But I want to point this out. It's interesting that Russell didn't have the term fractal, because Mandelbrot coined that term in the early 70s. But essentially, when he's saying that wave fields are unfolded within wave fields, he's describing fundamentally a fractal structure. So it's, as I say, it's recursive. It just keeps going down to infinity, up to infinity. It's really only relative to your pressure condition where you exist. So the wave field has it has one interesting property that accounts for many of the reasons that motion moves within it the way that it does. One thing I want to point out is that in a cube, the diagonals are longer than the diameters. So the length from corner to corner exceeds the length from side to side or top to bottom. And because of that, when there's motion from a center outwards, this means that resistance to that motion makes everything curve toward the cubes, the corners of the cubes. And this is how basically centripetal motion is wound up into the corner. And so this becomes sort of a termination point where the amplitude of the wave is located. But we've also heard that the anode is also the cathode, and so this is also a plane where extension occurs along that diagonal. But I just want to point out that this curvature, you see that all directions of momentum is curved and all motion is spiral. Now you can see why, because it simply has to follow to the corner of the cube.
It would on the other corners too, right?
Correct. Well, that's where there would be avoidance, because if you can think of it, this would be one time cycle. It would be moving out to these corners, but the simultaneous reaction is that it's happening here as well. So, but again, you're only perceiving half of it at any one time. That's why I sort of started with that, because these things start to make a lot more sense if you realize, oh, this is only one instant in time of a cycle. So it's really actually quite difficult for Russell to do to put this in a two-dimensional diagram, because these are three-dimensional dynamic things, and this is a static diagram, right? So this is why he's showing that this is, curvature, and the momentum is spiral.
How close is that one on the right to the Fibonacci sequence and the golden ratio?
Trying to go back.
I mean, it looks just like it.
Very close. He also has, I've seen the 9 octaves utilize that same spiral. And this is sort of, they call this, sort of the signature of the divine architect, because you see this type of spiral all over the place. But, to me, it's a self-similar thing. So you see the same thing in galaxies. You see the same things in a string if you pluck it, if you look at it the right way. So again, we see this as a sort of the underlying mechanics behind all vibratory motion, and all motion is vibratory. So now that we understand a little bit about the interplay between gravity and the cube wave field, I just want to point out that basically the basic impetus for motion is the sex principle, and science is paying a heavy price for not really considering this. For instance, my background is biology, and it's sort of par for the course that we understand that everything is divided into male and female, plants, animals, so forth. The one thing that we're paying for dearly, though, is that science does not consider minerals to be male and female. That is, the elements of matter are not considered to be male and female. They're considered to be sort of these things that have charges, and they can chemically only unite if they're valence electrons, and so after a while it's just like, no, I don't buy it, because basically the elements of matter are male and female, and so the impetus for motion, the whole reason motion even happens, is because things are divided into male and female. So polarity, gravity, and sex are all one thing. But they are divided into pairs so that they can be united as one thing. So again, this is a good way of showing visually the avoidance principle. If you consider something like an airplane, as it's moving along, the shaft along which it is traveling is zero potential. In other words, it isn't moving at all. What's happening is there's electrical spiral around it, and wherever it is moving toward is a collision point. So it's being met by an equal and opposite avoidance. But again, you only see half of it. This is why we think things move. You're only seeing half of the story at any one time. Here's another example where you're throwing a pebble into a pond. You throw it, as you throw it, the path in which the pebble takes to hit the water is zero potential. This is termed a gravity shaft, just as the diagonal is in the cube is a gravity shaft. And as it collides with the surface of the water, it sends out centrifugal rings in one plane to our senses. But if you could see this the way an illuminant sees it, that extension in one plane is a sphere. Just as it's wound up centripetally, it's also a sphere. So, and again, it's being met by its equal potential to create the effect that we observe. So,
can I ask a question, sir?
Certainly.
This is a 40-year question for me. Diagonals, when they reach the zero corners. Now, do they invert, or is that sequence just constant throughout each cube wave field? Does it compress, or does it stay, that sequence is just happening simultaneously, there's no compression once it, out of the diagonal, and you throw it out, it expands, and at that zero in the corner, does it invert and compress?
Well, it's met, so every effect, you can see from this that every effect requires two wave fields. Because you have to, if the action is in one wave field, the reaction is in the complementary wave field.
Okay, got it.
Does that make sense?
Yep, that nails it.
All right. And yeah, anybody can stop me at any time, because I know this is, we're going to get excited.
If you do want to do interactive presentation, let me get a mic to you so that the live stream people can hear your question.
And this diagram, I know it's a little bit hard to see, but it shows the same concept that sort of action and reaction is simultaneous. But again, if you keep in mind that you're only perceiving half of it at any given time, you can always know the other half of what's going on. And that's a very valuable thing for science to know. It explains the full story rather than half of the story. So Russell makes reference to sort of reducing things down to simplicity. He just refers to there's basically two tools of creation, and there's one tool of repetition. The two tools are what are known as biconvex lenses and biconcave lenses. Biconvex lenses are what would be termed vesica Pisces, or an intersection of two spheres. When they move past each other, you get biconcave lenses. And as you can see, when they form and they work as one unit, you get spheres and all sorts of oblations and prolations of spheres. In other words, distortions of spheres. The one tool of repetition is essentially the cube, because its boundary represents a place where all curvature disappears. This is a good way to visualize this is imagine if you have a cube and you inflate a balloon in it. It's going to be spherical all the way until it hits the corners, the sides of the cube, at which point it flattens out. The minute something flattens out perfectly, it is beyond our senses. We cannot detect it anymore. Right? So everything within the wave field that's curved, we think is something, as long as it's moving. The minute something is flat perfectly, so this has a huge consequence, which I'll say is that what you think is a straight line is not a straight line. Even if a building appears to you to be perfectly straight, remember when I was showing you the eye? There's a cone in your eye and it's curving light. So even what you perceive to be a straight line in the physical universe is not a straight line at all. It's curved because it's within a wave field, just as you're within a wave field. So, and this is Ben Palmer constructed these mirror cubes, and it really shows this idea of repetition. You never exceed the wave field boundary. You only repeat it as an infinite regression. And so if you have a few lights within a cube mirror and you look within it, you can see that it extends to infinity. And you can never really find where it terminates because it doesn't, because it's just moving back and forth within the wave field.
What confuses me is everything, first of all.
No, what confuses me is that you have a cube, and Russell had a cube, and it looks like it has a finite boundary.
Yes.
But this is two-dimensional, and
The cube is three-dimensional.
the cube is three-dimensional. That's right.
Yes.
But it looks like it's got a finite boundary, but it really doesn't.
Not to your senses.
Not to my senses. Oh. Anybody else?
In other words, think of it this way. When you look at the horizon, say you're standing on the horizon, you're standing in the middle of railroad tracks. You can see on the horizon that they appear to meet on the horizon, but you know that they don't. They run parallel to one another. Right. So your senses are always doing this. They're always sending things out to infinity that appear to go to a termination. But you know that it's not, because it's basically just that form is repeated to infinity by the dimensions of the cube. So this is a huge deal because this means that all force has some sort of, it's multiplying and dividing by cubic ratios, which is exactly what Russell states. Okay, so just a little bit more on lenses. objects appear to come out of space and disintegrate back into space. And scientists have a big problem with this because, they have an idea of how things disintegrate back into space, but they have absolutely no concept of why it comes out of space to begin with. If they knew the optical nature, they would know exactly why that happens. This demonstrates sort of the disintegration, and this represents how things are integrated. It's projected from one wave field into a collision. The best way I can describe this is when you pluck a string. At the middle of the string is where the action's happening. That's where the sound is. It's at the very middle. So it's a collision from two sides into one thing. Okay, so it's wound up. It's wound up out of space. And how is it wound up? It's projected by lenses. And we're going to see exactly how these lenses form from basically outward motion. It's interesting to me that Russell did revise one thing in particular about inward pulling. An inward pull from within is not one half of a force. He basically finally just said all force is the result of an outward thrust. In other words, all matter is explosive. So even the integration of matter is an explosion, but it's an explosion into one center of gravity. You can call it an implosion. I guess that term does work. So basically, an explosion in a collision creates matter, and an explosion from the inside disintegrates matter. And that process is completely controlled by the curvature of gravity, which is what we're calling lenses here, optical lenses. And you can see the colors. You can see the colors really well, and we're going to show how so perfect sphere, maximum density. This is when mass is accumulated at its maximum density. You can see that it's an accumulation of all colors. This is why the sun appears to be like bright white. It's like incandescence is the only way I can describe it. It's basically all colors compressed into one location, one region of space. When it disintegrates, now you can see how color is actually following the path of density. And we're going to show a picture of that in a little bit. One thing I just want to point out one thing about magnetic fields, because we're going to cover more of that tomorrow. I don't want to get too ahead of myself. But supposedly there's a magnetic field around our Earth, and it's supposed to be created by some sort of molten iron at our core. Does anybody actually believe that? Didn't think so. So, and it's impossible. I'll tell you why that's impossible. If you take a magnet and you heat it up, it loses all of its magnetism. Does everybody know that fact? If you don't believe me, just try it. Buy a magnet, they're cheap enough. Try to melt it, it will lose all its magnetism. So if the core of the Earth is molten iron, there's no way it could be magnetic anyways. So it's not magnetic. So this field around the Earth is not magnetic. In fact, it doesn't have anything to do with magnetism. As you can see, what they're interpreting is there's some kind of curvature that they're perceiving, and they call those magnetic lines of force. It's not magnetic lines of force, though, is it? Because you know exactly what these are now. These are lenses. So the compressed lenses within a spherical mass bend light out in radii. And you see where it has to terminate? It has to terminate back at the equatorial plane, the plane of collision, remember? So I just wanted to point out one thing, that basically all masses are made of rings. And I can think of no better way to show that than this, Saturn. And again, we can perceive these rings because they're radiating. And we perceive the radiative half of the cycle. So Saturn, in essence, is dying. And its dying process is ejecting rings at the equatorial plane, which we can observe. Jupiter, also, again, rings. So all masses is basically bilateral. It's male and female combined into one spherical mass.
Question.
Yes?
So are we calling gravity focused light?
It's conditioned, yes. To me, the best way to think of gravity is it's a point around which something is happening. And again, because it's a cycle, it's hard to pin it down to one particular thing. But it's in essence, it's a point, it's a locatable point in space around which electrical potential is spinning. Does that make sense? Okay. One thing I try to get away from saying that it's an attraction of any kind, because it isn't really an attraction. We'll see in a little bit. It's more of a compression. So gravity is basically the zero motion around which compression and expansion is occurring in wave cycles. So another sort of thing. I don't want to spend all my time dispelling, saying that everything in science is wrong, but there is this one particular troubling concept about parallel light rays. As I said, there's no magnetic fields in nature. Electric fields, there are electric fields of curved motion, which are bounded by magnetic planes of non-motion and zero curvature. That is the cube. This is also sometimes termed gravity field. So you could think of the magnetic field as both a gravity field or an electric field. I think both are correct. It sort of just depends in what context you're talking about. Just like magnetism is related to gravity in the sense that you can think of a chair or an armchair. It's really how you're using it and what you're talking about. Excuse me. But so getting back to parallel light rays, because this relates to the gravity field. Remember, this looks just like the field around the Earth, but you can see it's the result of a lens. It's not really a magnetic field or magnetic lines of force. It's curvature of light. So there is no parallel light rays, unfortunately. It just doesn't happen because these can never run parallel one next to another. I don't even know where that concept came from, to be honest. Maybe early experimenters, I'm not sure. But again, you can see, so this biconvex lens projects things to a center. Biconcave bends things outward to a mutual equator. The two of them have to work together to form our universe, otherwise forces wouldn't work the way that they do. Also, you can see that these are both extensions from a zero outward in both directions. So this concept of 0 to 90 degrees, forces working at 90 degree angles to one another, this is why, because of the optical lens effect. So I could honestly spend all day talking about these types of waves, but basically I just want to point out here that, again, that all these wave effects are the result of an outward thrust. When you leave a plane of stillness, it's an outward direction. It's an outward direction from, you can think of a two-dimensional plane out to a three-dimensional extension. When it's colliding and it's sending out rings on an equatorial plane, it's also an outward thrust. So again, we see that integration and disintegration are both the result of one unity of force. Again, so remember what I was saying about density? This force moves outside in and inside out, and as it moves, the colors go with it. So this is the Lyra Nebula. You can see that the blue is on the inside, the red is on the outside. But there's also a cycle of the wave where the exact opposite is the truth, and that's how stars form. It's formed from projecting colors either inside out or outside in. And density is the same effect. Imagine if you took these rings and you compressed them together into a sphere, you would have a sun. If you expand those rings, as the colors shift, now you have an explosion, a nebula, right? So this isn't gas. This isn't, it's light, as it always was. All right, so Coulomb. I get this a lot. The Coulomb law is a fallacy. It basically states that like poles repel and unlike poles attract. This is basically the old thing that opposites attract, likes repel. But Coulomb used the term in this sense in the terms of magnetism. He was doing this with either two magnets or also the sense of charge, charged particles. By the way, the worst thing you can say to me is negative charge, because it's like nails on a chalkboard. Think about when someone says negative charge, scientists love to say this, by the way, everything is ions and everything is a negative charge. Supposedly the Earth has a negative charge, the ionosphere has a positive charge. Negative charge is a complete fallacy because it's like saying silent sound.
Yes.
It's a complete negation of term. Charge means to generate or to integrate, and negative means to negate. So it's like saying adding by subtracting. Doesn't make any sense. So there are no negatively charged anything anywhere in the universe. There is only negative discharge. That is the only appropriate way to state that. So Coulomb basically thought that he was seeing that opposite poles would attract and similar ones would repel. But Newton said basically the same thing if you use the concept of matter with mass. He said basically mass attracts mass, which is the same thing as saying poles attract poles. Both of these miss something vitally important, which is the zero of attraction, which is another way of saying gravity. Oh, geez, I got to get going. When an astronaut goes out into space, he loses weight, right? We say that it's zero gravity. Why is it zero gravity? Because he's reaching the middle of a bar magnet. Do iron filings stick to the middle of a bar magnet? No. Absolutely not. Where are they at? They're at the poles only. So now we can see what we think of as attraction is a compressive force exerted from the outside direction toward the inside being the poles, gravity foci, instead of an inward pull from the inside of the mass. I have about 10 minutes left. I was really going to cover the laws of thermodynamics.
We don't care.
Basically, okay, I'll go through them a little bit. So this is a really good way to really, so if you want to study the sort of cyclical nature of the universe, these 7 laws of thermodynamics will go a long way, because basically everything is either cold light or hot light. Cold light being equilibrium, hot light being dynamic motion of light, which again is a simulation. So first law, cold generates energy, heat radiates energy. Cold multiplies, it cannot divide because it's the fulcrum. And the fulcrum has to extend to multiply. Heat divides, it cannot multiply but can be multiplied. We know that as fact because we can take a furnace or something and just make it hotter. So we can multiply the heat, but it cannot itself be multiplied. The second law, every action must be preceded and followed by its equal and opposite reaction. Preceded, that's the important part. Heat is the reaction of cold. Heat could not come into being save for the compressive action of cold, nor could it repeat itself without losing itself to basic cold. So you see, everything has to return to cold. This is the idea of entropy. We see bodies seem to come out of cold space, and they have to radiate back to space. Everything does that. Everything is born, it grows, it lives, it falls back down in decadence, and then dies again, back to cold, back to the zero. By the way, the Big Bang states that the universe was an explosion and now everything's expanding outwards. And they also, it's basically the idea that heat is less cold. But the Big Bang took place in space, did it not? Therefore, space is cold. The Big Bang must have been cold. That means that heat comes out of cold, which is the exact inverse of what normal thermodynamics says. So they sort of contradict themselves by perpetrating this concept of a Big Bang. So it's much easier to just get with what's really going on, which is that the universe is constantly creating itself. It was not one event which is expanding outward and then will eventually just die into nothing. the universe universe constantly creates and is constantly creating, and you're all part of that. Third law, cold is static, it's unchanging, it's unconditioned. It eternally lives. Cold light is the basic one thing of the universe. Again, going back to that picture of the one white light of mind. That is a visual representation of that. Heat waves are dynamic, they're forever changing, and they're dually conditioned. They are eternally living and dying to simulate life. Fourth law, cold light is the omnipresent basis of the universal intelligence and energy. Energy, that's going to play into fact tomorrow. Hot waves of light, which man calls matter, are a simulation of intelligence and energy. There is no intelligence or energy in matter. I'm sorry, Mr. Einstein, there is no energy in matter. E equals mc squared. It's only half the story, again, remember? Static cold and dynamic heat express their opposite energy of 90 degrees from the axis of rotation. Cold retains its static motionless condition along wave axes where motion ceases at points of maximum heat. That is, again, the collision. While heat extends along equators to expand as cold. We saw those with the rings of Saturn. They're expanding outwards to the cold of space, to the demise of Saturn. This balance interchanging completes the wave cycle, one continuous cycle. Sixth law, cold compresses. Cold multiplies cold to create heat. Again, heat comes out of cold. Heat expands to divide heat into cold. Varied pressures of heat constitute the octave color spectrum cycles and the octave chemical cycles of matter. I'm sorry I didn't get to cover the periodic or the Russell chart of the elements. Their varied wavelengths are the basis of our mathematics. And the one final thing I want to cover is the seventh law, which is probably one of the most interesting and one which required me to think about a lot of things because there's a seeming contradiction within it that needed to be worked out. There we go. So the seventh law states, long low waves of low potential and high frequencies constitute the invisible spectrum and low density gases. Remember Jim was saying a minute ago, the 3 octaves preceding hydrogen. These are long waves. They're so long in sense that your senses can't perceive them. And this is also how motion simulates low density gases. And short high waves of high potential and low frequencies constitute the basis for high density solids. But wait a minute. We're saying that long wavelength and high frequency is low density. And then we're saying short wavelength of high potential and low frequency constitute solids. Well, that appears to contradict what's commonly known in electromagnetic theory, because frequency and wavelength are inverse relationships. So this is a completely new scientific fact that is completely not understood at all. Because it seems to be a contradiction of what everybody thinks to know to be true about wavelength and frequency. As wavelength decreases, frequency increases. Frequency decreases, wavelength increases. The answer to this is time. Does anybody know the unit of a frequency? Cycles per second? Hertz. Or cycles, yeah, hertz is cycles per second. This means that cycle per second, this means that frequency is a function of time. So if time is an illusion, then also so is frequency. So this is how I work this out, because this is how motion simulates solids and also simulates low density gases. And it's frequency being a function of time, but time is basically contracting and expanding, as all things contract and expand. So think of it this way: when a mass is wound up, it acquires a large amount of density, which requires a longer amount of time to express its cycle. For instance, the sun is a huge mass, takes billions of years to run one cycle, one life cycle, one frequency. So it's extending time as it accumulates mass.
Would you be able to help me out with a guitar string analogy of this?
Sure. Later? Or okay. So I thought you were going to get a guitar or something. No, we were going to jam out. Okay, so okay, yeah, this will be good. So say you're going to pluck an A string. The idea of A is a concept, and you're going to give it a body momentarily in time, right? By doing what? You have the desire for the tone of A. You pluck the string, which means you give it dynamic power. The string is at equilibrium, and you pluck the string, and when you do that, you're adding dynamic tension to it. You're disturbing the equilibrium. Now, imagine, the string is fixed at two ends, right? Doesn't move. Those are the poles, gravity poles. As you pull it and you release it, now you've released the tension. The reaction occurs, which is a projection from both poles to the collision and sends out the sound wave on as a centrifugal expansion, right? Perpendicular. I mean, in reality, it's spherical, but you can't really see that. So as far as your ear is concerned, the tone is really an expansion wave through the air. It's a compression wave. So the frequency is fast enough to simulate the A tone, right? Out of all the potential of frequencies that it could be, it is the one that we identify as the tone of A. So it's manipulating time in order to simulate the idea which it is. Does that make sense? So in that sense, we give it a body, but really that body lives and dies. It grows to maturity, which is the tone that we hear, and then it dies. And it does that fast enough to be a continuity in time that we call A.
Could you liken that to say that all bodies are like guitar strings themselves?
Absolutely.
Even the human
and
body?
every mass has poles, does it not? As does your body, as does the earth, as does everything. By the way, this is Russell's last painting, and I figured it was fitting to end on that.
It's called Dying Planet.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question, please? Just a quick question.
Sure.
So the long frequency and the long wavelengths, and the reason that they're a high frequency is because the windings are closer to the gravity shaft? You understand my question? I'm just envisioning this long wavelength, and so in my mind I'm thinking long wavelength, then the tone or the sound would be inaudible, but if I'm reading that correctly.
And high potential.
High potential, yeah, I think of potential like pressure, almost like voltage. It's sort of...
And the pressure is what causes the high frequency. Is that what am I saying that correctly? I think of it more in relation to mass, like how much mass it accumulates. Like, for instance, I have this quote. This is right from New Concept. It says, when a thought wave cycle wind up into masses of waves to create bodies, they slow down their repetitive frequencies and thus lengthen their cycles of growth and decay in proportion to the mass of thought waves which have been wound up into a formed body. So it's really how much is wound up into the mass is what contracts or expands time. And since time is expanding or contracting, the frequency changes as a result.
And Darren, on the analogy of the guitar string, you've got the circumference of the string, the body of the string, but also you have the tension of the string. Because as you turn the key and you tighten that string, the
it's
frequency
pressure
increases.
Right. That's a good analogy for the octave wave, because each inert gas sort of represents that you're going up, the strings are getting shorter and shorter, which means higher tension, right? So like when you have a guitar and you're really up on the high frets, the sound gets so high eventually that it's almost inaudible. So you know that our sense perception is only seeing things within a certain range. So frequencies high and frequencies low, you don't really see much of them, do you? Right? So yes, the string is under tension, which represents an octave pressure.
Does that not kind of nullify the New Age assertion that we should raise our vibrations?
Right. Well, that's why that's kind of why I did that. Yeah. And it's something that it's a difficult thing when I was reading it for me to figure it out, because this relationship of frequency and wavelength, it's the way it's taught, you sort of just accept it. But if you really read Russell carefully, he's saying the inverse, which means you have to think about it more. You have to think about the relationship between what is solid and what is tenuous, right?
Just one brief comment. In Unit 8 of the home study course, the Russells replace the term matter with idea bodies or thought bodies, so that had helped me with comprehension. So thought bodies, idea bodies.
Yeah. Yeah, physical bodies really are, as I think it was Jeremy was saying, that, for instance, the idea of a podium is a concept, but if you craft it and build it, it simulates that idea. And so in this sense, the entire universe is a simulation of idea, and the substance of which you use to accomplish that is light. But there has to be like a scaffolding. There has to be a way to extend it into time and space in a way that creates the experience of what we know to be in our experience. The way I look at it is Russell essentially gave us the concept of our atomic age, because he gave us the idea to look for deuterium and tritium, plutonium, neptunium, and so forth. So his knowledge of what the atom actually was and its structure is far beyond what our current knowledge is of it. And again, with the sort of that first image I showed, where like the electric ring around body around mind, that basically means that all atoms are rings. So fundamental particles are not spherical masses. They're various conglomerations of rings, right? So I would always go with Russell as a starting point in really understanding atomic structure. Because of the cube and the various interactions of motion, there's almost an immense amount of geometric variation you can get out of that. There is a diagram, I'm sure some of you have seen it, but basically it's a cube sphere. It's a spherical shape that has an enormous amount of geometric shapes within it. And within that shape, it's called an E8 Lie group. That mathematical shape has just about every geometrical shape you can think of in it. That's a good way to think about the relationship of the sphere and the cube, and how all atoms and all conglomerations of atoms have to have some sort of a geometric relation to one another. Just as that you saw in the mirror cube, a few lights in a certain places makes this huge geometric pattern that's repeated all over the place. That's essentially how atomic structure works when you're thinking about like a crystal, for example. Right? That's why you have cleavages, different planes. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That'd be synchronous to say that any object we desire to build, first we construct the concept or the scaffolding,
Right.
and then the scaffolding itself is the mind, which then creates the body, which is the objectification of the scaffolding. So literally the scaffolding, it being mind, always precedes the form. So
Right, and you notice how you can't have curvature without flat planes. So the flat planes control the curvature. So the same is true in atomic structure. There's a geometric shape that relates to every atom.
Were you saying just a minute ago that the sphere had the cubes inside of it? And all these shapes inside? So
He calls it the cube sphere. It's called an E8 Lie. It's a geometric mathematical shape.
Okay. But in that situation, the cube is on the inside of the sphere,
Right.
where the other one was the other way.
It's an enfolding, yeah.
And so I just thought I'd throw out that the volume of a cube with the side of 1, it's 1. And so if the radius of the sphere is 1, you have this cube, it would be rattling around inside of the sphere. But if you change the dimensions of the side of the lines of, the edges of the cube by the golden ratio to make it 1.618 and 0.618 and 1, then all 8 points will touch the sphere. So it's the same volume, but it'll fit in there.
Right.
And I wondered if that might have shown up in any of those configurations you were talking about.
Generally, I only consider the sphere sort of ends when it hits the sides of the cube.
Right. In this
So then-
instance is the way to get the cube of volume 1 to actually terminate at the circumference of the sphere. So I thought that was an interesting inversion.
Yeah.
Put 'em-
It's interesting. You have to really just stare at these diagrams and really turn these things around in your mind and play with them. That's the best advice I can give, is to just play with these, play with spheres, play with cubes, because the cube really only exists as a perfect cube around carbon, which is a perfect sphere. When it's any other stage of carbon, which is what we think of as the elements of matter, that cube is no longer perfectly cubical. It's distorted, as Russell would say, which just means that it's a different geometric shape. This is why we get a variety of different forms, because the scaffolding is constantly changing. Thus, all the curvature is changing, and thus the reality seems to change.
I have one more question, and that is when you said that Walter Russell changed his mind about the inward movement and said it's all explosion, even if it's exploding into the point. Is that the same time that he changed his mind about showing the negative and positive
Yes.
number line? Because that would
Yep.
mean the same thing, right?
Yeah, and we'll talk more about that tomorrow, because that's very applicable to understanding electronics.
Good, okay.
That concept is very important. Yeah, he did get rid of this sort of idea of positive and negative. Almost everything is, for our purposes, it's positive extension in both ways, the negative being the equilibrium in the middle. So for instance, just like with the bar magnet, you can see that since nothing was attracted there, that's negative. It's zero. It's negated there. So positive are both poles. We'll talk more about that tomorrow. Thank you.